Okay, so just to set the scene a little bit. So greenwashing, as far as I recall, and I've been in the industry for 15 years already, has always been in the shadow of sustainable investments. But now it came further into the spotlight, and especially in the financial sector area. So we thought it was really timely to talk about it. So today what we will see is we'll put a little bit of context around greenwashing and what it means exactly. We'll talk about the different shapes and forms that it can take, and you will see that there's a lot of creativity in there already. You will also see what kind of initiatives are being discussed at the level of European regulators to tackle greenwashing, and what can be done already. So just to give you a little bit of guidance on that. So as I was saying, greenwashing has always been there in the shadow, but it really came into the spotlight something like 2 years ago at the COP26 in Glasgow. And so that was November 2021. And at that time, the United Nations created a high-level expert group on net zero emissions commitments. And they published a report on that. At that time, if you recall, there was a lot of mounting pressure from the civil society, notably, that were calling for making sure that the commitments that were made at COP26 were really put into actions afterwards. So there's a mounting pressure from stakeholders who have decided to take companies, banks, insurance, accountable for their climate change claims, and they're really following up on that. So what do we mean by greenwashing? If we go back to the basics, the term appeared in the 1980s, so that's not too long ago. And actually the term greenwashing came into the Oxford Dictionary in 1999, so that's pretty recent to me. What it means in general is, Virginia said, there's no regulatory definition of it, but still there is a definition. In general, greenwashing is a process of conveying a false impression or giving misleading information about a company's product or service, and to make it look like it's environmentally sound. It usually involves unsubstantiated claims to make consumer believe that a product is environmental friendly, or that, and that's also important, or that it have a bigger impact or positive impact on the environment or on social aspects that it actually does. I've put here on this slide a number of examples of the shapes of greenwashing. I won't go through all of them because I think you'll get the slides afterward, but I just wanted to mention a few of them. The first one is an interesting one, the hidden trade-off. And that is suggesting that a product has environmental claims, but you don't really pay attention to other major aspects of the product or the service. And here, as an example, I could think of the electric cars that are arguably environmentally or creating a positive environmental impact, but also the batteries are made from conflict minerals, and so there is a lot of discussions around that as well. There is also the no proof greenwashing, and that's something that is quite frequent actually. And I take here the example of fast fashion brands that have those, conscious collections for their clothes, but actually there's no sufficient information or evidence to show that there's an environmental benefit behind that. Vagueness is very common as well, irrelevance as well. And the less of two evils, I like this one as well as a good example. And it's the fact of distracting consumers from the greater environmental impact of their products or services. You've got here the example of organic cigarettes, but I also like the example of banks, for example, who would claim that they have switched to renewable energy in their buildings, but they continue to substantially finance the oil and gas sector, for example. Then you've got also the worshipping, the false labels. giving the impression that you have a stamp, that you have a certificate for actually an entity that has no endorsement at all, and the very famous misleading graphics. And you've seen that in many ads already. There was HSBC, if I recall, who was banned also on an ad that they had using those kind of graphics. I also remember, that's quite a long time now ago, the British Petroleum, who changed their name to Beyond Petroleum, and advertising solar panels in their gas stations, where at the same time they were contributing a major part of their financing to the oil and gas sector. So that's the type of examples that we see when it comes to greenwashing. Now, if we look at the type of greenwashing incidents and to what they are related, I found this study quite interesting, and that comes from RepRisk. Some of you may know them. They are an entity who produce scores about companies on their ESG reputation risk. And so they looked at a 10-year data set on greenwashing incidents, and they looked at what kind of topics were popping up in there. And what we see in that slide is that climate change and the greenhouse gas emissions are taking more importance over the years. And you may have seen actually yesterday Shell, and that's why there's a little screenshot here. They are allegedly accused of not taking into consideration climate risks in their strategies. When we look at the sectors as well, this is something that is important. Greenwashing appeared essentially originally in the retail products that are sold to the great public on TV with the ads, marketing and communication around that. But what we see now with the study from RepRisk here again is that all the sectors now are concerned by greenwashing incidents or misleading claims. And there was a study that was interesting from the European Commission. They have screened websites to identify breaches of EU consumer laws in online market. They focused essentially on greenwashing. And they found out, and that's a very striking number, that 42% of the online claims from various business sectors may be false or deceptive. So it's not only now the oil and gas sector that is concerned, but all the sectors actually are under high scrutiny. Now, of course, what we want to talk about today is the financial sector, and financial sector is not exempt from those greenwashing claims neither. What I wanted to put in that slide is examples of how greenwashing can apply specifically for two types of instruments that we are discussing today. So for example, the investment funds, but also for the bonds. When it comes to the investment funds, what we observe most of the time is the asset managers being quite vague or ambiguous when it comes to their responsible investment methodologies. Sometimes it's not clear neither whether the methodology applies to the product itself or at the entity level, so that's not clear neither. There is a lot also of concern about the names of the funds, and Eugenia already alluded to that, but there is a consultation paper, and I'll go back to that afterwards, on the fund names as well, because it is true that it's the first thing actually that investors see of a product. It's the name of those products. And so you need also to be very careful with that. There is also something that is important to mention, and that's related to misleading communication. And that's where there is the preconception that having an ESG process means that there is an environmental outcome in the real economy. And if not clear for the investors, asset managers sometimes are playing on that. And they would say, we have a process, and so else we are good for the environment. It's not necessarily equal. And so you need to be sure that you've got evidence to prove that. And of course, last point is the actual deception. This one is very clear. A fund would say that it has an ESG screening in place, for example, but is not applying it at all. So quite understandable, this one. When we look at the bond side, there are also some elements that are being discussed around greenwashing. The first one is the lack of ambition. And here, I think the products that are the most under scrutiny are the sustainability-linked bonds. They are great instruments, but they need to be used wisely and in a transparent manner. And what happens with the sustainability-linked bonds, for those who are not familiar with it, is that the issuers of SLBs, they have to set sustainability performance targets within a set deadline that they need to achieve. But what we've observed in some cases recently with those SLBs, and that's not the case for all, but sometimes the targets are not ambitious enough, not clearly defined enough. And so that is also something that could be subject to greenwashing. There's also the question about mismanagement of wider sustainability risks. So that would be the case, for example, of a green bond financing a very good green project, but not looking at the social aspects that would be around that could be detrimental as well. So if I could make the link, it would be the do no significant harm aspect to be looked at in there. There's also a big point around the strategic inconsistency. And here, that is really a discussion that appeared over the last 2-3 years. It's when an entity issues, for example, a green bond, but the strategy of the issuer itself is not sustainable or is not in transition. And so that creates an inconsistency between the issuer and its product. And here again, there is the actual deception. And I already mentioned it for the fund. So that's the same thing. That would be, for example, a green bond that says that it will finance green projects, but that does not actually happen. So this led to a lot of cases, actually, where financial actors have been exposed to greenwashing risks. And all of us, I think, remember the DWS case, where the German prosecutors actually went to the DWS premises and they were investigating in there because they said that there was evidence that emerged that the ESG policies or factors were applied in only a minority of investments for DWS and not for the majority as they would claim it. HSBC also, they had ads that were banned by the UK regulator. And there's also a lot of watchdogs, civil society watchdogs like BankTrack, who are looking more and more at the commitments made by financial players and actually identifying where there's a mismatch, or shall I use the word greenwashing? I don't know, but where banks, for example, that commit to net zero emissions by 2050, but still continue to finance fossil fuel, for example. So I don't want to scare you, but still you see that since last year, there's been quite a lot of number of articles in the press around that. So the financial regulators, the policymakers, they have all claimed to clamp down on companies making exaggerated claims about sustainability credentials. So there's enforcement actions that have been taken place. The ECC, for example, in the US with BNY Mellon, but also in Australia, for example, with Vanguard, who self-reported itself because they had ESG funds that were applying an exclusion policy, but they were tracking an index that were not. So they self-reported themselves for greenwashing, to the Australian securities regulator. So now you will see you've understood the context. There's more discussion around greenwashing. There's more sanction around that, and obviously, then the regulators have decided to put that topic forward end of last year and this year. So there's more scrutiny. There are two main categories, and usually I mentioned that also, the two main categories of regulations which are potentially applicable when it comes to greenwashing. There are the financial sector regulations, but also the consumer protection. But yes, I was saying that there are a lot of regulations that could potentially address greenwashing. Consumer codes, environmental codes, but also financial regulations. So there's a lot of regulation codes and laws that could integrate this aspect of greenwashing. I don't want to go into the details of this slide, and I would not be knowledgeable about all these laws actually, but what the slides tell you is that there have been rules to incorporate misleading advertising, whether it's about greenwashing specifically or not, alongside all along to protect consumers across the globe. So you can see, for example, the question of increasing penalties for greenwashing in Australia, reminding consumers of their rights and the laws in Canada. There's a development of codes, specific codes in the UK with the Green Claim Codes that was published in September 2021. And in France, for example, the environmental code, where they added or specified greenwashing in there, and they said they specify rules applying to terms that, and we'll go back to those terms: zero carbon footprint, climate neutral, and all those terms. And this will enter into force, or this has entered into force in January 2023. Now, when it comes to specifically anti-greenwashing rules in the financial sector, there's been also a global reaction around that. In November 2022, the IOSCO, which is the International Organization of Securities Commission, they have published a call for action aiming to counter the risk of greenwashing. This is November 2022, but before that, there was already a lot of reaction around the world. In March 2021, for example, the US SEC, they have created this climate and ESG task force with actions to include misstatements, failure to follow policies, or misleading clients. In Europe as well, as soon as March 2020, the AMF, which is the French regulator, they had issued a doctrine, and in that doctrine, they were already addressing the way asset managers and distributors sell their products, and they were already addressing the question of the fund names. The UK FCA is also proposing anti-greenwashing rules for the time being, and the ESAs, the European Supervisory Authorities, have issued a number of papers, but I will go back to that in a few slides. On the Asian side, very interesting as well, Singapore's ESG labeled funds guidance has kicked off in January 2023. And in China, also very interesting, they have green fund rules that are expected for the first half of 2023. Now, if we focus on the ESA's calls for evidence that was mentioned a few times already this morning. So the European Supervisory Authorities, they issued a call for evidence, CFE, on greenwashing at the end of last year. So that was from mid-November to mid-January. The idea really here is to clearly define greenwashing, get the views from the actors, get some examples as well. And that's a call for evidence. They wanted to have examples of greenwashing and evidence on that as well. And a key question was also if there is any available data, to help identify further greenwashing and get a sense really of is that big or not? Is that something that is perceived or really happening in the market? So as you can see, the call for evidence ended in mid-January. So we are all, I think, looking forward to the results of that. There was a lot of debate around this call for evidence, notably around the segregation of market participants that could play a role in greenwashing. There are market participants that could be considered as triggering greenwashing, but also the spreaders and the receivers. There's also a big debate, I think, because I've seen some answers to this call for evidence around whether or not greenwashing is only intentional. There was a lot of questions around that. And also on the topics covered by greenwashing, because greenwashing implies green, but it's not necessarily only greenwashing, but you can have social washing and many other colors in your rainbow, if you wish. There are many shapes also for greenwashing, and the channels used to greenwash can be also very different. So all of that was analyzed within the CFE. Along that, roughly at the same time, the ESMA, so the European Securities and Markets Authority, I've issued a consultation paper on fund names. And that's what Marco mentioned also this morning. And that consultation on fund names is really important as well. I think it's still, I don't know if it's still in consultation. I think, yes, I think it's, I think the end is mid-February. But so the point here really is to look at the terms that are used in the fund names to make sure that they are not misleading, and specifically frame the use of ESG and sustainability related terms in the fund names. So in that slide, and I know that we have someone from ESMA afterwards in our panel, and please, if you have specific questions on that, ask them, because that's very technical. But I will try to explain still. What the consultation paper says is that if a fund has an ESG related word in its name, then it should allocate a minimum proportion of at least 80% of its investments that should have environmental or social characteristics. If you're asking what kind of ESG related words would that be, there is no list for the time being, so this would need to be clarified, of course. On the other side, if a fund has the word sustainable in its name, it should allocate within the 80%, at least 50% proportion of sustainable investments. Here again, no definition about or no list of terms under the sustainable related terms. And that goes back to the questions that were asked this morning as to how does that match or connect or disconnect with SFDR Article 8 and Article 9, because if you remember what was said, Article or SFDR is a disclosure regulation. It's not a label. It does not tell you how much percentage you should invest in specific investments, although Article 9 was clarified and it should be 100%. So this still needs to be clarified. There was a lot of question around that. The key point is really that the fund names are a key preoccupation here. They are subject to greenwashing and they should be looked at. As I was saying, there is a lot of market reaction around that. Positive in some sense, because we should all combat greenwashing and tackle it, but also some warnings from some players that are afraid that there will be even more downgrades under the ESMA naming guidelines. So there's a lot of clarification that is still required on that aspect. Just to make things even more simple. The UK, also the FCA, is also working on the fund names. But for those of you who don't know, the UK, they have their own SFDR, which is called SDR. And in that SDR, they address the our Article 8 and 9, if you wish. They make them labels, and that's what you see on top of the slide there. They have 3 labels: sustainable focus, sustainable improvers, and sustainable impact. And if you're outside of those labels, you should be restricted from using the terms that you see in that screen. So, for example, Paris aligned, climate, environment, sustainability, transition, and the like. So they're also working on the fund names. Of course, there will be a question about cross-border investment funds who sell in Europe, and they also sell in the UK. And they will have to apply these fund name rules on both sides. So that will be a challenge, I believe. So now, of course, the consequence of that, or consequences of those sanctions and regulations, are the fact that fund managers are being very cautious around what they claim. They have downgraded more than $140 billion in ESG assets. So there is a big wave, and for those of you who are in the industry, you've probably seen that. We've seen that at the stock exchange as well. There's a big wave of reclassification of Article 8 and Article 9 funds. Now, what can be done? I need to look at the time. 10:41, so we're good. Now to look at what can be done to combat greenwashing. Of course, the do's on the left-hand side are: you have to be sure that when you claim something, you have to have evidence. You have to be able to substantiate that. It should be clear, measurable, verifiable. And I really want to warn in there, because I was an auditor in the past working for KPMG on ESG claims, and I am pretty sure that this is going to come. So we see that audit aspect with CSRD. It's already happening, and there's a limited assurance moving to reasonable assurance on the ESG claims. I'm sure this is going to happen here as well at some point. So you have to have evidence of what you're saying, and you have to be accurate, balanced, and proportionate in your marketing materials. Don't seem to be obvious, but maybe a checklist should still be good when you make some claims. So don't omit or hide important information. Don't over claim the features and the benefits of your product. Do not exaggerate on that. And if that's possible as well, make sure that you can have your claims verified. That's always better. Here, I just wanted to put the recommendations of the UN HLAC that I mentioned previously at the beginning of the presentation. They are not completely related to what was mentioned on the fund names and the like, but still it's important, because what we see a lot are commitments to net zero. They are very common nowadays, from corporates, from banks, from insurance, from stock exchanges as well. But here there are still recommendations, and it's along the lines of what I've just said. They need to be measurable. They need to be set within a timeline. You need to make sure that you use offsetting or voluntary credits in a sensible manner, and not just to continue business as usual. You need to be able to disclose also about what you're doing. So there's a lot of very insightful information in this report if you're willing to read it as well. Another thing that is good to read is actually the IOSCO Good Sustainable Finance Practices that were published in November 2022. They try to give very straightforward good practices for 2 types of players: the ESG ratings and data providers, and the asset managers as well. Everything around those good practices seem to be common sense: quality, independence, conflict of interest, transparency. That seems that that seem to be common sense, but still it's not necessarily always the case that it is applied. So it is important to consider them as good practices as well. Just to let you know, on the ESG rating and data providers side, the UK FCA is also working on a code of conduct for those ESG rating and data providers. I'm actually part of that working group. And so we are working on those good practices as well for the market. Now, as Eugenia was mentioning, these sanctions that we've seen articles in the press, these consultation papers, call for evidence, they put a lot of scrutiny on the financial players. So some of them just decide to hide or to lower their claims and be quite silent, or because they don't want to be put in the spotlight, they don't want to be under scrutiny. So I think Eugenia used the term green bleaching. I saw the term also green hushing. We can debate on that. But anyway, that's also the unwilling consequence also of what's happening there. So I think the message here is that we need to find balance on how to combat greenwashing in an efficient way, but not deter the market from going the green route as well. Now, I wanted to finish this presentation by explaining a little bit what we're doing at the Luxembourg Stock Exchange in that sense to combat greenwashing. There are a number of elements here. Of course, we do a lot of advocacy and engagement. We are part of many working groups, notably at the International Capital Market Association, ICMA, who works a lot on impact indicators, on guidelines for SLBs that I just mentioned. We also publish research pieces. We've done that last year on the SLBs and on the taxonomy to make sure that the market understands what are the best practices in the market. And within our organization, and it's very important, we've decided to train 100% of our staff on sustainable finance. So for the time being, and we started last year, we have 60% of the staff that is trained. And we hope to complete for the remaining 40% this year. So that's on the advocacy and engagement side. On our products and services as well, we are trying to make sure that transparency and trust is there. That's our role as a market operator. So with the Luxembourg Green Exchange platform, for example, we ensure that there's the highest standards of transparency that are applied for all the GSSS bonds that are displayed on LGX with our database, which includes more than 10,000 securities, and we collect very granular ESG data. We make sure that asset managers, that investors, they have this granular data to understand what kind of projects have been financed by the bonds, what impact it has created. So that really also helped the market in combating greenwashing. We give best practices and benchmarks with the assistance services and with the academy, of course. We train financial professionals to bridge the knowledge gap. And that's really something important, we believe, because in the specific case of unintentional greenwashing, there is a lot that comes from people not being trained enough on the topic or not knowledgeable on the topic. On top of that, we also have other aspects that we're looking at. So, because I mentioned the Luxembourg Green Exchange is doing a lot of things, but the Luxembourg Stock Exchange as a whole is really working on that. We have internal safeguards that we are working on. When we meet securities on LGX, we make sure that we have discussions internally. We extensively discuss the green aspects of our issuers, but most of it, when an issuer will be onboarded on the Luxembourg Stock Exchange in the future, we will also look at their ESG reputation risk, and that's really important as well to look at. We are also a signatory of the Defense and that's a brilliant name, NZFSPA, and that's the Net Zero Financial Alliance for Service Providers. We are a member of that alongside other stock exchanges. And you know that GFIN's been a lot criticized. We are working very consciously on having an action plan that makes sense. It's not always an easy task to do it, but we have very concrete actions that we want to take on our carbon footprint reduction and also on the fossil fuel issuers as well. So just to conclude on that, it may be a bit worrying and scary and décourageant. I don't know how to say that in English then, but to see all these debates around greenwashing, but it's really sometimes also an opportunity in disguise, because then if you make sure that you implement all these processes, if you have those evidence to substantiate these claims, you may well be a leader of sustainable finance in the future. So that's where I wanted to stop now, but I'm happy to take any questions as well.